based on the repayment plan that you're eligible for or that's provided by the contract. If you don't pay those installments, however, the loan goes into default, and what that means is the entire loan balance becomes due all at once. You no longer have access to all those programs, and depending on the type of loan you're dealing with, the lender can pursue certain collections actions against you. So when does default happen? Well, for private loans, really depends on the note itself. Default is usually defined in the promissory note that underlies the specific private student loan. In practice, most notes say that being 30 days late on a payment triggers default, but as a practical matter, most private lenders and servicers don't default the loan that quickly. Usually happens between 180 days and, usually happens between 90 days and 180 days. That's usually the window that I see default happening, so about 3 to 6 months. Federal default happens at a much more concrete time because it's prescribed by federal regulations. The magic number is 270 days. So the time between 0 days past due and default is a period of delinquency when you're behind on payments, but the loan contract hasn't been broken, you can cure it. When you hit default, that's when all that negative stuff happens. For federal loans, it's 270 days past due, 9 months. That is when the loan goes into default. So there's a lot of time in there to try to cure it, and if it can be cured, it should be, and then default occurs at the 271-day mark. So what happens when you go into default? It's pretty bad, to be perfectly honest. So regardless of whether the loans are federal or private, there's going to be pretty similar consequences here for borrowers. You're going to see your credit report get trashed. It's likely going to go into collections with a third-party debt collector. Schools might withhold the borrower's academic transcript. This is particularly true if the borrower owes the school. So that could be for a defaulted Perkins loan where the school is the lender. It could be for a defaulted institutional loan where the school is the lender. It could be for an unpaid tuition bill. And sometimes for federal loans, even if the school isn't the lender, the Department of Education historically has encouraged actually academic transcript withholding. It's a way to just pressure students to pay. And it can be really debilitating for borrowers who need to access their transcript. And of course, litigation is possible for all private student loan defaults, for all student loan defaults. The difference here is that for federal loans, because the federal government has such powerful tools to pursue borrowers, they're unlikely to use litigation nearly as much as private student loan lenders, because for private student loans, the only way to go after borrowers really is through litigation. 90% of debt collection lawsuits result in default judgments because they go unanswered, either because the borrower was not properly served or because the borrower didn't know his or her rights or options. And so it's just something to be aware of. For private student loans, a lawsuit is always a risk. I've had clients, who didn't know that they were sued or didn't know how to respond properly, and that can result in a default judgment. For federal student loans, you're going to see a lot less litigation. It's a little bit regional in terms of where lawsuits occur. I see very few lawsuits in my own jurisdiction in Massachusetts with federal lenders. Other parts of the country, they're a little bit more aggressive. So it really does vary a bit by geographic location. But some of the non-judicial consequences of federal student loan default are still pretty serious. So borrowers can be denied, they will be denied new federal loans. So if they didn't finish their degree, they defaulted and they want to go back to school, and they're going to need federal aid to do it, you're not going to be able to access that federal aid while you're in default, and that can be a big problem. Federal law authorizes really exorbitant collections fees and penalties to be tacked on to the balances of defaulted federal. So those fees are, quite frankly, a bit absurd. They can be up to 25% of the combined principal and interest balance of the federal loan. So if you have a $40,000 defaulted loan, just by virtue of going into default, you're going to see another $10,000 tacked onto them. If you have $100,000 in defaulted federal loans, that balance is going to go up to $125,000. Again, just a penalty of defaulting, they just tack on those costs, and 25% under current law is considered legal. Federal government also has really powerful tools to pursue borrowers involuntarily. They don't need to go to court for any of this. They can intercept the borrower's tax refund and apply it to to your loan involuntarily. They can garnish a borrower's wages, again, without needing to step foot in a courtroom. They have to go through a process. They have to send you a letter. They have to give you notice and the opportunity for an objection or for a hearing. But ultimately, they can garnish your wages without needing to go to. And there's no statute of limitations on the collections of federal student loan debt either. That means there's no time limit here. They can literally pursue you to the grave. I have had clients who have a 30 or 40-year-old federal student loan, and they just started working again, or they just started collecting Social Security, which can also be garnished, by the way. And they have to deal with this federal loan from 30, 40 years ago that is now 10 times the amount they originally borrowed because of interest accrual and collections charges. It's a disaster. But it's important to understand really what's at stake here when you encounter a borrower who has defaulted federal loans. Doesn't end there, though. Things are even worse. There are what I call secondary consequences of default. This isn't something that the federal lender or the federal government does directly to people, but it's sort of inevitable consequences of being in default. So obviously due to academic transcript withholding and the inability to get new federal aid to complete the degree, many borrowers who were not able to finish the degree, let's say because they encountered a medical problem and had to drop out, or maybe they had a sick family member, they're not going to be able to finish those degrees. And so now they have an unfinished degree, they have a bunch of student loans that are in default, and they're stuck. Because of the credit report consequences, borrowers might have trouble securing stable housing. I've had several clients who were evicted because they had a very problematic, time in their lives. They lost their job or they got sick. They defaulted on their loans. They fell behind in rent. They got evicted. But now they can't get a new apartment, not necessarily even because of the eviction, but because of all the defaults that are showing up in credit. It can also be difficult to secure stable employment. Increasingly, employers are doing background checks and pulling credit reports, and seeing defaulted loans, especially defaulted federal loans, can be a bar to employment. And this is especially true for borrowers who are seeking employment either with a federal or state government or with a federal or state government contractor. It might actually be required that they not be hired if they have a default on their record in terms of having a federal student loan. And borrowers can lose their professional licensure. This varies substantially from state to state, so you'll have to consult your own state laws. But depending on the type of student loan that's at issue, borrowers can be at risk of losing their nursing license, their teaching license, their medical license, their law license. This is real stuff, and this can really, really cripple people and keep people trapped in a cycle of poverty.